So today, we're jumping right back into the action. We're going to look at the immediate, chaotic, and frankly, surprisingly organized aftermath of a massive rebel victory against a full on Roman legion. All right, just picture this for a second. You're a rebel in Judea. You've just done the impossible. You've routed the forces of Cestius Gallus. So, what's the play? What's your next move? Do you throw a massive party? Try to negotiate? Or do you realize you've just kicked the biggest hornet's nest on the entire planet? Well, for the leaders back in Jerusalem, there were no illusions. This victory, this wasn't the end. Oh no. This was the terrifying beginning. They knew Rome, the conqueror of the known world, was not going to let this defeat stand. Retaliation was coming, and it was going to be overwhelming. The only thing they could do was get ready for the real war. But getting ready wasn't so simple. That stunning victory, believe it or not, immediately ripped open some deep cracks within Judean society and, at the same time, unleashed some absolutely horrific violence just outside its borders. You see, far from uniting everybody, the success actually sent a lot of the elite running for the hills. For the wealthy aristocrats, many of whom had done pretty well for themselves under Roman rule, this victory wasn't a sign of hope. It was the final, suicidal act that would bring total annihilation. They started treating Jerusalem like a sinking ship, and they were looking for any way off. And this split, it was happening in real time among the most powerful families. On one side, you had guys deeply tied to the pro-Roman establishment, like the brothers Costobarus and Saul, and Philip, a top commander for Rome's client king Agrippa. They didn't even hesitate. They fled the city and went straight to the defeated Roman commander, Cestius, ready to offer up intelligence. But then you had other powerful men, like Antipas, who decided to stay, a choice that, spoiler alert, would end up costing him his life at the hands of the more extreme rebels. This was not a unified front. This was a society tearing itself apart. So, what about the Romans? Well, Cestius, totally humiliated by his defeat, immediately started playing the political game. He sent some of those same Jewish defectors, like Saul, straight to Emperor Nero over in Greece. And his message was simple. Hey, this whole disaster, it wasn't my fault. It was the governor, Florus. He's the one who provoked the Jews into this war. It's a classic case of a commander trying to save his own skin by passing the buck. Now, while all the elites were maneuvering and trying to save themselves, the news of the Roman defeat spread like wildfire. And in the neighboring cities, it had immediate and incredibly bloody consequences. Over in Damascus, the local population had already rounded up the city's Jewish men just on suspicion, basically holding them captive in the public gymnasium. So when the news arrived that an entire Roman legion had been wiped out, their fear just boiled over into pure rage, and they decided to act. In a terrifyingly short amount of time, 10,000 men were slaughtered. And the brutality of it, it was just staggering. These men were completely unarmed, trapped in a confined space. Their attackers, apparently worried that their own wives, many of whom were sympathetic to Judaism, would find out, carried out the entire massacre in just 1 hour. It was swift, it was merciless, and it was a really dark sign of the kind of violence that was about to spread everywhere. Okay, so back in Jerusalem, in the middle of all this growing chaos, the rebels who chased down Cestius finally returned to the city. And they weren't just a victorious mob anymore, they were now the de facto government. Their task was absolutely monumental: turn this popular uprising into an organized state that could actually fight a war. They all gathered in the temple and got down to the serious business of creating a real command structure. They chose governors to run the city with a big focus on repairing the walls. And most important of all, they started appointing generals and assigning them to defend specific regions of the country against the Roman counterattack they all knew was coming. And here was the new leadership, a kind of coalition of all these different factions. You had the high priest Ananus and Joseph son of Gorion tasked with running Jerusalem itself. To secure the borders, other commanders were sent to defend key strategic zones: Idumea in the south to act as a buffer, Jericho to guard the eastern approach, and the lands across the Jordan River. But you could argue that the most critical assignment of all went to our main narrator, the historian Josephus. He was given command of both Galilees, the northern region where the Roman invasion was almost certain to begin. So let's really zoom in on Josephus for a minute, because what he did in Galilee is a perfect case study of how this new rebellion was trying to build a real army, basically from scratch. See, Josephus didn't just show up and start barking orders. His approach was incredibly methodical. First thing he did was get political buy-in. He won over the local population by sharing power with a council of 70 respected elders. Then, he built a functioning civil society, appointing judges in every city. It was only then that he turned to military matters. First, by fortifying dozens of cities and towns, and finally, by trying to turn a bunch of farmers and villagers into actual soldiers.
So why all this focus on order and discipline? Well, Josephus tells us himself. He totally understood that Rome's greatest weapon wasn't its sword, it was its system. He said the Romans were invincible for two main reasons: constant practice and unwavering obedience. He knew he couldn't replicate decades of Roman experience, but he thought he could at least replicate their organization. He was trying to forge a Roman-style military culture, creating captains of tens, hundreds, and thousands, and teaching them signals and maneuvers, all of it copied directly from the enemy's playbook.
And the scale of what he was doing, it was just immense. This wasn't about building a wall around one or two strongholds. Josephus was in charge of a massive campaign to fortify key strategic locations all across Galilee, from major cities like Tiberias to fortified positions on mountains like Mount Tabor. The entire region was being turned into a huge defensive web, designed to bleed the Roman war machine and slow it down.
So what was the end result of all this political maneuvering, this wall building, this training? Well, it was a brand new army, ready to defend the north. And he actually managed to pull together an army that, on paper anyway, looked pretty impressive. This wasn't just a militia anymore. This was a structured, provisioned fighting force. The core of his new army was 60,000 foot soldiers, all drawn from the local population of Galilee and armed with whatever old weapons they could get their hands on. But that's not all. He also supplemented this main force with about 4,500 paid mercenaries and a personal bodyguard of 600 elite troops. What's maybe even more impressive was the logistics system he set up. Each city sent half its men to fight, while the other half stayed home to work the land and send food and supplies to the army. The workers fed the soldiers, and the soldiers protected the workers. It was an entire nation mobilizing for total war. So in a remarkably short amount of time, the rebels had gone from a disorganized mob to a semi-professional army with a clear command structure and a real defensive strategy. They had an army, they had fortified cities, and they had the will to fight. But the one question hanging over everything, the question they were all about to have to answer, was simple. Against the full, methodical, and vengeful might of the Roman Empire, would any of it be enough?